Have you ever seen football players with the eye black that says Philippians 4:13, or perhaps you've seen basketball players that write it on their shoes? And maybe you know what it says, but you wonder, is there a Bible passage that really says that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me? Well, the answer is yes, that Bible's passage does say that. But the deeper question is, does that passage mean that I can run in for a touchdown, that I can shoot a basketball accurately because Christ strengthens me to do that? In today's video, we're going to examine that passage and look at the true context there and realize that no, the passage is not talking about scoring a touchdown or hitting a three-pointer, but it's talking about something deeper than that and actually more powerful than that. Now, this is a case of where people are taking a passage that gives a general spiritual truth, but then often the general spiritual truth is what people know about rather than the immediate context of the passage that was given. So let's take a look at Philippians chapter 4 and what Paul is saying in this passage. So if we go over to Philippians chapter 4, what we're going to first do is look at the immediate context, just the few verses leading up to verse 13, but then we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at some verses even earlier than that. And what we're going to see is that all of this fits together in a way that really expresses a much deeper spiritual truth than just what sometimes athletes like to put on their shoes or their eye black. So in Philippians chapter 4, beginning with verse 10, Paul is writing to the church at Philippi, and he's bringing his letter to a close. And so he says, beginning with verse 10, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." So you recognize that last verse. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What I like to say about this passage is that verse 13 really sums up what he has been saying in those four verses leading up to it. When you look at verses 10 through 12, I guess it's three verses leading up to it, those three verses, 10, 11, and 12, Paul is saying to the congregation there in Philippi, I know you wanted to help me out in the past, and I rejoiced because you've been able to help me out with the work that I'm doing, and you had you lacked opportunity in the past to really be able to do something for me. But then when he says that, because he's going to talk more about that in the latter part of this passage, really in verses 14 and following, we're not going to look at that today. But in verses 14 and following, just briefly, one of the things he does is he really says, you've shared with me in this. And so that when Paul was going out and he was going on these missionary journeys and he's going and preaching the gospel, there were congregations that were helping him out and that shared him not just in prayers, but also in helping him with needs that he had. Because in many cases, if he was going to start a new work in a location where there were no Christians, it really helped to have other people that could either come with him or that could give him supplies so that he could do the things that he needed, and not, for example, as he did in the book of Acts. It talks about how his primary occupation was a tent maker prior to becoming a Christian and really going out and preaching the gospel full time. And so there were times where he and Priscilla and Aquila did work as tent makers. And he would do this from time to time to support himself. But you had congregations like the church at Philippi who could help. And so in verse 10 here, he is referring to that, and he gets back to that in verses 14 and following. But what I want to focus on here is what he says in verses 11 and 12, because that is the immediate context leading up to verse 13. In verse 11, Paul says that I'm not talking about needing something. I'm glad that you helped me, but I'm not in this situation where I am needy, because I have learned in whatever state I am in to be content. And so he says in verse 12, he gives various situations. I know how to be abased. I also know how to abound. Everywhere in all things, I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. So if you're the Philippian congregation and you're hearing this letter being read by your brother Paul, And Paul is saying these things, and Paul is saying, I appreciate your help, but I've learned in whatever state I'm in to be content. Not just when I'm full, not just when I abound, not just when I have plenty, but also when I'm hungry, also when I'm suffering need, also when I'm abased. I have learned how to be content in all of those situations. So I imagine sitting there and listening to this admonition from Brother Paul, the apostle, and saying to myself, I wonder how he does that. How can he be content in whatever situation he's in? How? And then Paul gives the answer. Verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So that I can do all things is referring to his ability to be content in all situations. And we know all of the persecution that Paul went through, but then there were also plenty of times where things went well for him. And he is saying, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, through Christ who strengthens me. So the all things is referring to his contentment in whatever situation. So when you think about the application of this more broadly, where people say, I can do well at my sport through Christ who strengthens me, you understand very quickly that yes, Paul is saying that the strength to do the things of God is from Christ, but he's not talking about sports, certainly. What he's talking about is contentment. And so it would be interesting to ask, is the athlete content when things don't go well in the game? Can they be content whether they win or lose? Can they be content whether the shot goes in or not? Can they be content if they're able to catch the pass or not, or whether they fumble the football or not? Will they be content in any situation? Then in that case, Philippians 4:13 would go right up their alley. That would be the thing to say. But I'm afraid that that's not what people mean when they want to appeal to Philippians 4:13. They want to appeal to I can do these powerful and amazing things on the gridiron, or on the baseball diamond, or on the basketball court. I can do great things through Christ who strengthens me. But Paul's point was not only that good things were happening and so Christ was empowering him to do that, but he was talking about even when things aren't going great, when I don't abound, when I'm abased instead, when I'm not full, when I'm hungry instead. He says, in those moments, I can be content because of Jesus. Now, I want to end today with something a little bit earlier than that. We talked about this on a previous video about why Christians should get rid of the word worry and the word anxiety from their vocabulary. And that comes in earlier in Philippians 4, the verses leading up to what we just read in verse 10. Philippians chapter 4, beginning with verse 6. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Now you might be saying, Jerry, what does that have to do with what we just read in verses 10 and following? Well, it has everything to do with it. In verse 9, Paul goes on to say, the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. When we talked about this passage before, about how you should be anxious for nothing, but make your requests made known to God with thanksgiving. And then Paul talks about the kinds of things we should put our minds on. Then when you put that with verse 9, where Paul says, then the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, do these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul is giving us an example of how to think. He said, don't be anxious. He, as somebody that was doing missionary journeys and often didn't have support from congregations that he had to be there with, or new congregations that are just beginning to meet, having help from other congregations was a source of comfort. But he didn't always get that comfort. And yet he had learned how to be content in whatever situation. Why didn't he, instead of being content, be anxious? Well, it's what he's just told us. So Paul is not somebody who operates out of anxiety. He is someone who operates out of contentment. And he gives us this example in his own dealings with congregations, and specifically the congregation at Philippi. So what's cool about this is that you see Paul say, don't be anxious, and instead think on good things. And then what the things that you learned and received and heard and saw in me, do that. Well, like what, Paul? Well, here's an example. Be content in whatever situation you're in. And so Paul gives us as an example of this, how he can be out here doing these missionary journeys and still be content, even though sometimes he's not always getting the support from the congregations. Sometimes they don't have the opportunity like the church at Philippi, but he can be content when he's hungry or full, when he's abased or when he abounds. And that's an example of what it looks like in real time, in practice, to not be anxious, which is what he has just said earlier. So when we take all of that context together, what we find is that it's not wrong for someone to write Philippians 4:13 on their basketball shoes or to put it on their eye black. But one of the things that maybe they could be thinking about is, am I content? Do I have joy even when I fumble the football? When I make a turnover on the basketball court? When I strike out in baseball? Am I still content? Or am I not? Because Philippians 4:13 is a passage to help us remember to be content in whatever situation. It is not a passage to say, I'm going to do great things because of Jesus. And I'm afraid that's sometimes how we read it. So, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me is about contentment, not about being a champion on the court. It's about being good with God and having joy in all circumstances, not about just having joy when I get to raise the championship trophy, when I hit the winning shot, when I score the winning touchdown. That's not what it's about. So let's keep in mind contentment when we see Philippians 4:13. As football season gets ready to start, and you're probably going to see Philippians 4:13 on somebody's eye black, let's remember what it's really about. It's about contentment. Now that's it for today's video. If this was helpful to you, like the video, comment below to talk about Philippians 4:13. Maybe there's some other passage you'd like us to study and go through and really look at the true context so that we can draw from the text what we want it to say rather than reading into the text what we want it to say. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you do that as well. If you want more videos about the Bible, simple Bible teaching that applies to everyday life.